Mafia boss threatened Dean Martin on stage. His reaction was genius. The Rat Pack's golden era. In the glittering haze of 1960s Las Vegas, where the neon lights of the Strip pulsed like the heartbeat of American excess, Dean Martin was more than just a singer, he was a legend. Born Dino Paul Crocetti in Steubenville, Ohio, to Italian immigrant parents, Dean had clawed his way from the steel mills to the spotlight. By the early 1960s, he was the epitome of cool, a crooner with a velvet voice, a perpetual glass of whiskey in hand, and a laid-back charm that made audiences feel like old friends. He was the kingpin of the Rat Pack, that irreverent crew of entertainers including Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., and Joey Bishop, who turned the Sands Hotel into their personal playground. Las Vegas was a city built on dreams and deals, but beneath the glamour lurked shadows. The mob, organized crime syndicates from Chicago, New York, and beyond, held the reins. They financed the casinos, rigged the games, and ensured that every showgirl's smile and every dealer's shuffle served their empire. The Chicago outfit, led by the ruthless Sam Giancana, had a stranglehold on the Desert Inn and the Stardust. Frank Sinatra, with his own tangled ties to the underworld, navigated these waters like a seasoned sailor. Dean, ever the easygoing one, preferred to let Frank handle the heavy lifting. "I just sing and drink," he'd quip, flashing that trademark grin. It was September 1962, and the Rat Pack was at the peak of their powers. Their shows at the Sands were legendary marathons, late-night romps blending jazz standards, vaudeville antics, and off-color jokes that left the crowd roaring. Dean would saunter on stage in a tuxedo that hung just loose enough to suggest he'd slept in it, cigarette dangling from his lips, and launch into "That's Amore" with a wink. The audience, a mix of high rollers, celebrities, and mob enforcers, ate it up. But on this particular night, the air felt thicker, charged with an undercurrent of tension that even Dean's charm couldn't fully dispel. The show started as usual. Frank, the undisputed leader, opened with a fiery rendition of "My Way," his voice slicing through the smoke-filled room like a switchblade. Sammy followed with his electric tap dancing and impressions, drawing cheers that shook the chandeliers. Then it was Dean's turn. He ambled out, martini in hand, and the room erupted. "Folks, if you don't laugh at my jokes, it's okay, I'll just drink alone," he drawled, settling into a stool center stage. His set was a masterclass in effortless charisma, ballads like "Volare" that melted hearts, interspersed with banter that poked fun at Frank's temper and Sammy's height. But midway through, as Dean crooned the opening lines of "Ain't That a Kick in the Head," a ripple went through the crowd. At a front-row table, surrounded by stone-faced men in sharp suits, sat Johnny Rosselli, a high-ranking operative for the Chicago outfit. Rosselli wasn't just any mobster, he was the liaison between the syndicates and Hollywood, a man whose word could make or break careers. Whispers had circulated all week, Rosselli was in town to settle scores. Sinatra owed favors, and the mob's patience was wearing thin over some unpaid protection rackets tied to the Rat Pack's tours. Dean noticed him immediately. You didn't survive in this world without reading the room. Rosselli's eyes were locked on the stage, cold and unblinking, like a predator sizing up prey. As Dean hit the chorus, Rosselli leaned forward and muttered something to his companion, a burly enforcer named Tony the Blade Moretti. The words didn't carry, but the intent did. Moretti stood, his bulk casting a shadow over the table, and made a subtle gesture, a finger drawn across the throat. The audience missed it, lost in the melody, but Dean didn't. His voice faltered for a split second, just long enough for Frank, watching from the wings, to tense up. Dean recovered seamlessly, ad-libbing a line about kicks from old friends, but his mind raced. Was this about the skim? The mob's practice of siphoning cash from casino vaults before it hit the count rooms? Or something personal? Dean had always kept his distance from the rackets, but loyalty to Frank meant he was in the crosshairs by association. As the song ended to thunderous applause, Dean took a sip from his glass, his eyes flicking to Rosselli. The mobster raised his own drink in a mock toast, his smile as thin as a razor. Dean nodded back, his expression unchanging, but inside, the gears turned. He wasn't the type to panic, panic was for amateurs. Instead, he decided to play the hand he'd been dealt, with genius. The rest of the set blurred by. Dean bantered with the crowd, dedicating a song to the big shots in the front row, his tone light but laced with edge. When intermission hit, he slipped backstage, where Frank was waiting, face like thunder. What the hell was that? Sinatra hissed. Dean shrugged, lighting a cigarette. Just another fan, Frankie. Let's keep the show going. But as the lights dimmed for the next act, Dean's mind was already plotting his countermove, one that would turn threat into triumph. If you're enjoying this tale of glamour and grit, hit that like button to show your support. It helps spread the story to more fans of classic Hollywood intrigue. The Sands Hotel's backstage was a labyrinth of velvet curtains and hidden corridors, where stars mingled with sharks. After the intermission, Dean found himself in a dimly lit dressing room, the mirror reflecting a man who looked unflappable but felt the weight of the night. Frank burst in, Sammy and Joey trailing like worried shadows. "Dino, you see that? Rosselli's here for blood," Frank said, pacing like a caged lion. Sinatra's connections to the mob were no secret. He'd once been banned from Vegas for associating with Giancana, only to be reinstated when the bosses pulled strings. But debts piled up, and Rosselli was the collector. Dean poured himself another scotch, the ice clinking like dice in a cup. "I saw it, pal. But threatening me on stage? That's amateur hour." Sammy chuckled nervously. "Amateur? Those guys don't bluff, Dean. Remember what happened to that comedian last year?" The room fell silent. The comedian in question had crossed the wrong capo and ended up floating in Lake Mead, another accident, swept under the desert sands. Dean leaned back, his mind sharp despite the booze. He wasn't naive. Growing up in Steubenville, he'd seen the Black Hand extortion rackets up close. His father had warned him, the family takes care of its own, but cross them and you're fish food. Dean had built his career steering clear, but the Rat Pack's fame made them targets. The mob saw them as assets, drawing crowds that filled the coffers, but also as liabilities when egos clashed. As the group huddled, a knock echoed. It was the stage manager, pale as a ghost. "Mr. Martin, Rosselli wants a word." "Privately." Frank's eyes narrowed. "Tell him to go to hell." But Dean held up a hand. "No, let him come. We'll handle this our way." The door opened, and in strode Rosselli, flanked by Moretti. The air thickened with cigar smoke and menace. "Dean," Rosselli said, his voice smooth as oiled leather, beautiful set. "But we got a problem." He lit a cigarette, exhaling slowly. "Frank here's been skimming a little too much. You know how it is, family business." Dean met his gaze steadily. "Johnny, I'm just the singer. If Frank's got debts, that's between you and him." Rosselli's smile faded. "Don't play dumb, Dino. You're in the pack. That makes you family too. Pay up, or next show's your last." The threat hung heavy, but Dean didn't flinch. Instead, he chuckled, a low, genuine laugh that caught everyone off guard. "Johnny, you come all the way from Chicago to scare me during Ain't That a Kick? That's gotta hurt the pride." Rosselli blinked, thrown off. Moretti shifted uncomfortably. Dean pressed on, his tone conversational, like they were discussing the weather. "Look, why don't we take this on stage? Right now. Let the crowd decide." The room erupted in protests. Frank grabbed Dean's arm. "Are you nuts?" But Dean's eyes sparkled with that old Steubenville cunning. He knew the mob's power came from fear in the shadows. Drag it into the light, and it withered. Rosselli hesitated, then smirked. "You got balls, Martin? Fine. But if you screw this up..." He let the implication linger and left. Back on stage, the Rat Pack reconvened for the finale. The crowd, oblivious to the drama, cheered as Frank announced a special guest spot. Dean took the mic, his voice steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a VIP in the house tonight, Mr. Johnny Rosselli. Johnny, why don't you join us for a song?" Gasps rippled through the audience. Rosselli, cornered by the spotlight, had no choice but to stand and wave awkwardly as the crowd applauded. What followed was pure Martin magic. Dean launched into King of the Road, twisting the lyrics on the fly, trailers for sale or rent, rooms to let, 50 cents. No phone, no pool, no pets, but hey, Johnny, we got protection. The room exploded in laughter. Rosselli, red-faced but trapped, forced a grin. Dean pulled him into the banter, handing him a mic. "Sing along, pal, it's your town." The mobster mumbled a few words, and the crowd ate it up, turning the threat into theater. By the song's end, the tension had evaporated. Rosselli slunk back to his table, the message clear. Dean had flipped the script. Backstage, Frank clapped him on the back. "Genius, Dino. Pure genius." But as the night wore on, Dean knew this was just the opening act. The mob didn't forget slights easily. This chapter's twist has me hooked. What do you think of Dean's bold move? Drop a comment below with your thoughts on how you'd handle a mob threat. Dawn broke over the Las Vegas skyline, painting the casinos in hues of pink and gold, but sleep was a luxury Dean couldn't afford. After the show, he'd holed up in his suite at the Sands, the door bolted and a pistol, courtesy of Frank's connections, tucked under his pillow. The Rat Pack had scattered, Sinatra to a high-stakes poker game with the bosses, Sammy to a late-night jam session, Joey to nurse a hangover. Dean sat by the window, nursing black coffee, replaying the night's events. Rosselli's threat wasn't idle chatter. The mob's grip on Vegas was ironclad, enforced by figures like Mo Dalitz and Bugsy Siegel's ghost. Siegel had built the Flamingo with mob money, only to end up with bullets in his eye for skimming. Dean had heard the stories: cars driven off Hoover Dam, bodies buried in the desert. His own ties were tangential, Italian roots that opened doors but also invited suspicion. "You're one of us," Rosselli had implied, but Dean knew better. To the outfit, he was useful until he wasn't. A knock shattered the silence. It was Peter Lawford, the Rat Pack's British charmer and Kennedy brother-in-law, looking disheveled. "Dino, Sinatra's in deep. The skim's short. Giancana wants his cut from the tour profits. They think you're holding out." Dean sighed. The skim was the mob's lifeblood, untaxed cash funneled to Chicago. The Rat Pack's cross-country shows generated millions, and Frank had promised a slice. But egos and extravagance had eaten into it. "We gotta fix this," Lawford urged. Dean nodded, but his plan was forming. He wasn't paying blackmail, he was outsmarting it. By noon, he'd called in favors. First, his lawyer, a sharp New York attorney with mob ties of his own. "Dean, you can't joke your way out of this," the man warned over the phone. But Dean hung up and dialed another number, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI contact, a discreet agent who'd tipped him off about wiretaps before. The feds were circling Vegas like vultures. Hoover despised the mob, and the Kennedys, via Lawford, wanted them crushed. Dean fed just enough info, Rosselli's presence, the threat, names dropped. Not enough to start a war, but enough to make the outfit sweat. Then, he reached out to Rosselli himself, inviting him to a friendly lunch at the Copa Room. The meeting was tense. Rosselli arrived with Moretti, both packing heat under their jackets. Dean greeted them with open arms, ordering steaks and wine. "Johnny, last night was fun, but let's talk business." Rosselli leaned in. "The debt's 200 grand. Cash, by week's end." Dean whistled. "That's a lot for a singer. But how about a deal? You get your money, and I get a clean slate, no more stage fright." Rosselli eyed him suspiciously. "What's the catch?" Dean smiled. "Publicity. The Rat Pack does a benefit for your charities, Italian-American causes, you know. Front-page stuff. Keeps the feds off your back." It was a stroke of genius. The mob loved legitimacy, and Dean's fame could provide it. Rosselli mulled it over, then nodded. "You're smarter than you look, Martin." But as they shook hands, Dean slipped in the real ace, a whispered mention of Hoover's boys watching. Rosselli's face paled. The message landed, the threat cut both ways. By evening, word spread, the debt was settled quietly, with Dean's cut coming from future gigs. The Rat Pack's next show was electric, Dean dedicating "Everybody Loves Somebody" to new friends in the front row. Rosselli was there, clapping politely, the menace gone. Yet, in the quiet hours, Dean reflected on the cost. Fame's price was vigilance, and genius lay in turning enemies into allies, one song at a time. Loving the high-stakes drama? If this story's captivating you like a classic Rat Pack tune, consider subscribing for more tales from Hollywood's underbelly. Your support keeps the content coming. Years passed, and the Rat Pack's flame burned bright before flickering out. By the 1970s, Vegas had changed, corporate overlords replaced the mob, and Dean's career evolved into solo stardom, roasts, and that unforgettable sitcom. But the night of the threat lingered in lore, a footnote in biographies whispered among insiders. Dean never spoke of it publicly, true to form. Why talk about trouble when you can sing it away? In the end, his reaction wasn't just survival, it was art. By diffusing danger with humor and savvy, Dean preserved the Pack's empire and his own dignity. Rosselli met a grim fate in 1976, dumped in a Florida bay, but Dean outlived the shadows, passing in 1995 at 78, surrounded by family and accolades. The genius? In a world of threats, Dean chose levity. As he once said, "I'm not a star, I'm just a guy who drinks too much and sings too loud." But on that stage, he was both hero and maestro. What a ride through Vegas history! If Dean's clever comeback inspired you, smash that like button and leave a comment on your favorite Rat Pack moment. Let's keep the conversation going.